So thank you for everyone and joining Privacy Talk. Today I'm so honored to invite Mr. Bess from United States. He is one of the very important creators of the Internet Forum in the early days of the Internet. So thank you for Bess joining us on the interview.
Well, thank you, Koi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to share his profile. Wes was the sole founder in 1981 of Delphi Internet Service Corporations, the company that popularized the internet according to Mikhail Wolffs, and was the creators of the world's first online encyclopedia. At the time, it was sold to Rupert Murdoch to News Corporation in 1993. Delphi has been profitable for years and was among the four largest social networks along with AOL, CompuServe, and Prodigy. In 1986, while CEO of Delphi, Wes launched and spin-off Global Villages Inc. to serve magazine publishers and business clients with their own private label social networks. Wes focused the attention of his new team on the need for reliable identities of individuals on the internet, starting with the development of the Vivos enrollment workstation. While developing Vivos, Wes began collecting source material for a book about hypothetical world public infrastructures built upon digital certificates representing measurably reliable identities, which should bring authenticity to online interactions and the privacy to individual. As the book began to take shape, Wes was introduced to a group at the International Telecommunication Union that was attempting to implement a world PKI that was similar to the one he envisioned. Wes was subsequently appointed to the high-level experts group at the ITU's Global Cybersecurity Agenda. In an address in 2008 to the United Nations World Summit on the Information Society in Geneva, Wes introduced the city of Osmio, a new certification authority, best book entitled Quiet Enjoyment, published in 2004, with a second edition in 2014, was followed by best other title including Don't Get Noted in 2013 and Escape the Planations in 2014. Wes received his BS in physics in 1971 from the University of Central Missouri while serving at nearby Whiteman Air Force Base. Upon graduation and discharge, he became a system analyst at the Liberal Mutual Insurance Company, developing a mainframe database applications for the next 4 years. This is rated 12th in the 2023 Thinkers 360 list of the top 50 global thought leaders on security. He serves on the boards of Transit X Inc., Manual Music Inc., and Boston Baroque Inc., and lived with his wife Maria Wes Kussmaul in Boston's Back Bay. He has 5 children and 3 grandchildren. So that was great to see you, Bess, this time.
Well, thank you. That was quite a comprehensive review of my background.
Yeah, that's amazing. And first of all, I would like to start the conversation with you in the first agenda. So I'm very honored and I'm very curious to ask for your experiences at the beginning of the internet. So could you tell us why did you start to develop your own services in the early of the internet age?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we launched the world's first commercially available online encyclopedia in 1981. Now, back then, the the internet, the quote internet, there was the ARPANET, which was not strictly non-commercial. If you wanted to have a commercial online service, there was another packet network that used a protocol called X.25, and that was how our users reached our servers. I think I should mention that the encyclopedia actually morphed into the Delphi social network. The encyclopedia did not do well. Well, it did well commercially, but our cost of providing it was much more than our unit revenue. So it was not wasn't a good business. But when we stopped supplying the computer to access the encyclopedia database, and then we added social features, it became the Delphi social network. And as I say, it was accessed by a dial-up X.25 network. So we had telephone modems, and people would dial a local telephone number in one of these networks, Telenet and TimeNet. And that's how it all worked until around 1991, when a group in Colorado, the US state of Colorado, very cleverly found a way to confront the operators of what had become the internet. Back in '81, it was the ARPANET, but it had become the internet, and they confronted them to kind of compel them to support commercial traffic on the internet. And of course, the internet is a much better TCP/IP is a much better, more robust, more scalable protocol than X.25. So when they did that, Jack Rickard and Phil, I can't remember the other guy's name, but anyway, they offered to transport commercial traffic away from the internet backbone, and proposed that. And the operators of the internet backbone said, well, how are we supposed to tell which packets contain commercial traffic and which ones don't? And they said, well, that's your problem. We're here to transport the commercial ones. And they said, there's no way to do this. So that's when the US National Science Foundation just threw up their hands and said, we can't maintain this network. We can't maintain these non-commercial policies. And they pretty much threw the internet open to all kinds of traffic. And that's around the time when Delphi basically migrated to the internet. It wasn't suddenly, it wasn't overnight, but that's the process. As I mentioned, TCP/IP is a much better protocol, but not long after that, of course, we started getting web-based social media with a business model that we feel and has been demonstrated to not respect privacy. Web-based social networks from the Facebook and Twitter and the Chinese networks, their business model is all about getting our personal information and monetizing it, selling it. And in fact, these days, a lot of the best customers for that private information, that personal information, want to not know just about our purchase habits and that sort of thing. They want to know about relationships, beliefs, political feelings, political groups that we're part of, because it turns out that the advertising in these, I call them echo chamber groups, is particularly profitable. That's where the vendors of ridiculously overpriced diet supplements and investment schemes and all kinds of very high margin, high profit items are promoted. And very sadly, anger is what drives a lot of these people to what I again call the echo chambers, these groups where people all sharing one worldview, one point of view, gather, and they isolate themselves from wider discussions and wider sources of information. And it's not a good thing when the most profitable use of social media is generated with anger. So it's imperative that we find a way to bring accountable anonymity and real privacy to online spaces. And as I think you know, our answer to that is to address the fundamental nature of the internet. It was originally characterized as an information highway, and I think that still fits. So what is a highway but an outdoor public transport system? What if we're all working and living and keeping our files and letting our kids hang out by the side of the information highway? If that were a physical highway and we were spending our lives outdoors by the highway, we would seek an indoor space. And that's what we need in the internet. Indoor spaces, spaces of accountability, where you tend to know who's in a room with you. And indoor spaces are designated for particular uses by particular groups of people. And in our indoor spaces, we have, well, one version of it is called a residence. If you think about it, your home is a kind of a social network. It's where you bring your family and your friends and you socialize in common areas in your home. But then you also have an office in your home, typically, with a file cabinet that contains important information. That's not a public space. That's not a common space. You don't, your friends and neighbors don't come wandering into your private office. So in our, what we call my own office, we have what we call a digital file cabinet called My Own Information, or MOI. And that is a PKI space, quite secure, accessed only with your identity, PKI identity certificate, or by the PKI identity certificate of a designated licensee you designate your licensees to have access to your information. So for instance, your insurance company, you might issue them a license to have name and address and perhaps the vehicle ID number of your car, the number of miles you drive if it's an auto insurer, the number of miles you drive, and other pertinent information about insuring your car. So your insurance company always has up-to-date information about that part of your life. That's just one example of how you might share information from your MOI but no one gets to have any information from you without a license from you. So that's how we that's our view of indoor digital spaces, which I think will solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's the very important project. And as you mentioned, you are creators of the Parsed Forum project in Delphi. So could you share about your first project and why did you start about that?
Well, as we had started it as an encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia just was not a good business model. This was 1981, and parents wanted computer education for their children, but all the computer education courses were filled up. Everyone was stampeding to computer courses, and our encyclopedia offered them the personal computer, their choice of either an Apple II or a Tandy color computer, Radio Shack Tandy color computer, and a modem, of course, but unlimited support. That was one big mistake. So people would get on the phone with us first thing in the morning and expect us to be their computer educators for themselves and their children. So we had an unsustainable support burden. But there were other problems with the business model as well. But quite without intention, without a plan, we started adding social features. We added email. Well, it started out with email. You got email, but bulletin boards, forums, SIG, special interest groups, which turned out to be, an eye-opener for us. These social features, the encyclopedia usage was kind of like print encyclopedia usage. People are famous for buying this big, expensive set of books and using them intensely for a month or so, and then they tend to get neglected. And the same with an online encyclopedia. But the social features turn out to attract people to online sessions. So early in 1982, we said, this is, we have a workable business here, but it's not the encyclopedia business. And the word social network and social media didn't exist back then, but that's what it was. So it's quite by accident we found ourselves in the social media business. Is that what you were? And maybe I should take it from there and explain how we grew the business basically in partnerships with magazines, mostly computer hobbyist magazines. The Tandy user magazine, there was a magazine for Atari users, and these magazines partnered with us, and we'd provide them with a SIG, a special interest group, a small community within Delphi. And the magazine publishers expected that their readers and advertisers would stay within that group. But of course, people, an Atari user doesn't spend their whole life using their Atari and immersed in Atari stuff. They have other interests, and they find other SIGs, other special interest groups on Delphi, and started wandering around Delphi. So the magazines, I think the magazines were a big part of building our user base. And we didn't understand how we were we're sort of building our business on their backs and inadvertently taking advantage of them. I mean, we understood they were essential to our growth, but not, the fact that we were getting the better part of the deal. So we launched a product called Group Link, where a magazine publisher could build their own private label social network running on our servers using our technology, our software. And when I went on to start the spin-off Global Villages Incorporated in 1987, basically the Group Link product was what we built that business on.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. So after you had an experience in a new project, you changed a bit of the involvement with the international organization, international project at the ITU. So how did you work at the ITU and the World E-Trust Initiative? That's very important notice in the world.
Yeah, of course, I never moved to Geneva. I was, I guess, one of the first work from home people. But we recognized that well, I wrote the book saying that the way to bring accountable anonymity and privacy to online spaces is through PKI identity certificates. And the ITU saw it as a way to bring trust for commercial, the world of commerce, particularly to the third world, to the developing world. I took the consumer side of that, and Hamidou Touré and Alex Natoko took the commercial side of that, until we announced the World E-Trust Initiative in late 2004, early 2000, yeah, late 2004, early 2005. But it turns out the member states of the ITU didn't like the whole idea. A lot of these countries had their own national certification authority. So in other words, their own PKI, national PKI, and the World E-Trust Initiative implicitly made that national certification authority subordinate to the World E-Trust Certification Authority. So that was a threat to their sovereignty. But I also should tell you one story about when I came to deliver an address to the United Nations World Summit on Information Society in a few years later. Someone who had been involved in that rebellion, or not rebellion, but that the decision to terminate the World E-Trust Initiative, which, by the way, was handed off to us because Touré and Natoko did not want to see it die. So it's now the city of Osmio. But I was going to say that this person came up to me years later after I'd given that talk at UN WESIS and said, Wes, when the internet first came along, we saw that as a threat to our sovereignty. We didn't say that publicly, but that was a common feeling in the ITU. When World E-Trust came along, I being that other person, the person who was addressing me, said, I saw that as internet squared. In other words, it was a huge threat to our sovereignty. And that's a problem. That you know, the sovereignty of nations is deeply affected by all of our easy communication. Do you know the ITU was formed it's the world's oldest international governance organization. It was formed in 1865. And it was formed because some nations felt threatened by encrypted telegrams. And think about that. You know, they were concerned that that their adversaries could communicate with each other across national boundaries with encrypted messages that could not be interpreted by the government of those nations. So going back to 1865, that's how long nations have felt threatened by easy communication. Do you know also that there's a law, the ITU has a standard called the IRC, International Record Carrier rule, which says that all participating nations must license anyone who enables text communication across national boundaries. You need a IRC license to do that. Now, I have no idea whether that's been repealed or not. All I know is I was aware of it when we started Delphi. And I also know that people don't even know of its existence. I mean, it's in this day and age, how could you possibly exert that control? And yet there was a time, and it's still the case, where nations feel as though this easy communication, encrypted communication, information retrieval is a threat to their sovereignty. And I don't have an answer for that. You know, perhaps they're right. It's a concern.
Thank you for that sharing your experiences. It's a very interesting for me since I haven't heard about it before, but it's becoming realistic throughout your sharing experiences. Yeah, so let's move on to the next questions. So you speak at the another interview, then you said its internet is broken. So maybe you had some great experiences since 1980s, the early of the internet ages. So how has the internet changed since you had started your own internet services around the 1980s?
Well, first of all, I have to note that headline, "The Internet is Broken," is from an issue of MIT Technology Review from about 2004 or 2005. And further, I should note that we say that it's not the internet that's broken. The internet is a highway. The internet has always been characterized as an information highway. So what is a highway but an outdoor public transport system? The brokenness comes from trying to do things on the highway that should be done in buildings, should be done in these accountability spaces called buildings. That's where we run into trouble, because in a building, so there are three types of space, whether in physical world or digital world. There's outdoors, which we've mentioned. That's the information highway. There's indoors. There are offices and rooms and residences where you tend to know who's in the room with you. And then there's a public accommodation, which is somewhere in between those. So for instance, a retail store, a bar, restaurant, even a bank is a public accommodation open to the public. You don't need a special credential to get into a public accommodation, and yet it is a bounded space. So we're building the the latter two, the public accommodation and the indoor spaces, using what we call the quiet enjoyment infrastructure, which is built on a PKI system. We call it PKI done right. There are three parts of the quiet enjoyment infrastructure. There's the authenticity infrastructure, which consists of the first 6 components of QEI. Then the next 5 components are the indoors infrastructure, including the building codes and occupancy permits infrastructure. And then the third one we call the ontology infrastructure, which is all about the use of language to identify things. You may be aware that in the physical world, when an architect describes a building and annotates it on the drawings, the language used is very specific. You can't be vague in your language in describing a building. Unlike the world of IT, where, what is a server? What is a network? We invent, TLAs, 3-letter acronyms, and anybody can call anything and claim to be something when it doesn't. It has nothing in common with perhaps the inventor of that acronym. So anyway, that's the quiet enjoyment infrastructure, and we feel it's the solution to privacy and security problems. Provides real security, real privacy, real accountability.
Yeah, that's a very brilliant technology that you have been working this moment.
Thank
So
you.
maybe you mentioned about the privacy on this interview. And I think that you also mentioned about the accountability. So is there any things that's been a linkage of the accountability and privacy from your perspective?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Okay, my question is, you have mentioned about the privacy accountability. So what do you think the linkage of accountability and privacy from your perspective?
So there is an old model that we are inspired by. It was invented in 1901 by a neighbor here in Boston, or by a Bostonian, and it's the license plate, the automobile license plate. Think about your car's license plate. Anyone can see it, making you accountable for what happens on public roadways. But no one gets to know the identity of the driver or owner unless there's been an incident, or unless law enforcement feels as though you're transporting something illegal. That's our model. So our identity certificates, PKI identity certificates, carry with them a measure of their own reliability, but they also, we have some of our certificates, but of necessity have to have your email address in them. That's called an S-MIME certificate. And so you are disclosing at least that much about you to anyone who relies on that certificate. And we have other certificates that have names in them, but we also have the license plate certificate. You can assert your identity without disclosing your identity. As long as no one has claims against you, there's no need. This is like when Delphi was new, or actually the whole duration of Delphi. You got up to 6 usernames, and you didn't have to disclose to anyone who you were. They might need to know if you defrauded them, or you defamed them, libeled or slandered them in public, and then they could get a court order. And we did have people showing up with court orders saying, I need to know who this person is. So just like your license plate, there's trackability, but only through due cause, a right to know and a need to know the identity. So that's the model we use to provide accountable anonymity. I know a lot of people feel as though you can't have accountability and anonymity at the same time. And I would love to have a conversation with every one of those people to show that they're mistaken, that in fact, you can have accountability and privacy at the same time.
That's very important to talk about the accountability and privacy on the same table. That's be a very important to sharing the US thoughts and insights. So as for the future landscape, you are creating the mechanism, the Osmio, that's also the very important notice on this interview. So what do you envision for the future certification mechanism such as the Osmio in your mind?
Well, we see in the future a reconciliation between the decentralization community and the governance community. You know, the decentralization advocates have good reason for their feelings about centralized authority. You know, governments have not always or have often abused their authority. And that's the fear of that, the concern about that is what's behind decentralization. But at the same time, these crypto communities, all but Bitcoin, have centralized governance. They're waving the flag of decentralization, but at the same time, they have their rules about who can run a node, how nodes are run, what measures are in place to prevent, you know, the 51% vulnerability, etc. They're governed. So the point is not to, you know, we have this expression, I don't know if you have it in Japan, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, don't throw out governance with your concern about authority. Rather, do authority is right. There's a guy named, a decentralization advocate named Lawrence Lundy Bryan, who came up with a quote that we use all the time: there is no such thing as decentralized governance. The point is to make governance participatory, to build your identity database in such a way that an authoritarian government cannot penetrate it to find the names, the identities of people who've been critical of their regime, which we do with what we call the Internet of People protocol. And as I mentioned with MOI, to lock up your personal information in a vault that you control. You know, your relying parties do need access to different bits of that information, but it's only under license and it's only for the purposes specified in the license. So with those three measures, we think we're bringing substantial privacy to the online world.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's a very insightful for the decentralized community. That's very appreciated. So in the end, I'd like to ask you, give us the message. So you have great experiences from the area of the internet. Maybe we should have a talk about the future internet, how it will works. So could you share your last message to the listener?
Sure. We more and more we live our lives online. Our socialization is increasingly in social networks, in social media. We need to reform social media. Now, I have to say that the Chinese social media, some Chinese social media, points the way to the future. And that is the integration of commerce with social media. Here in the West, we have Amazon and others, other online merchants, and then we have Facebook. They're separate universes, and of course you can link one to the other, but the Chinese model, I think, shows the future, and that is, and this is part of our indoors infrastructure. We call it the real life business model, where a community has real estate business. People pay rent and they pay taxes. They pay taxes for the operation and maintenance of the platform. They pay taxes to Osmio, the city hall. But the revenue model is based upon commerce. Retail commerce and professional commerce. So, for instance, we once had a network called Biotech. Well, a network for Biotechniques magazine, and the idea is that people involved in the biotechnology community could buy their lab supplies in the same space where they network with other people in the biotechnology world. Really, the business model for the future of online. Take a look at conferences and trade shows, conferences and expos. It's particularly the expos where transactions are initiated. It's the future. And then we don't need to steal personal information. We don't need to generate these, rabid, angry echo chambers, where people get sold ridiculously overpriced. Really, there's a lot of plain old fraud going on in those things. Instead, it's you look around you. I look at behind me at the wallpaper, using my wife's computer here. So, you have an example of a place behind me where people are buying and selling things and socializing, and it's all in one place, all in one community. And there are spaces designated for meetings and retail and banking, etc. But it's not, they're not separate universes, and that's the Chinese model. And I think that's the future for social media and for basically everything we do online.
Yeah, thank you for your message. It's a time to be invented of the future internet. That's the very good to share your experiences and delivering the future internet with the new models. So, Mr. Wes, again, thank you for joining. It's a very honored to then have a conversation with you today.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.